Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Andrew Craig from SUNY Upstate Medical University, whose research has made important contribution to our understanding of behavioral persistence, relates, behavioral momentum, and translational behavior analysis. Dr. Craig will also be one of the speakers at the upcoming 14th SABEC Congress, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Alejandro?
I'm great too. Thank you very much. To begin, could you tell us a little about yourself and your professional journey? What first attracted you to behavior analysis?
That is such a great question. And I think that if you ask any behavior analyst, you'll get a very different answer. And that's one of the things that really excites me about the field. I was an undergraduate at WVU, West Virginia University here in the United States. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I picked psychology as an undergraduate major because I came from an area of Pennsylvania where we didn't have a lot of different kinds of educational opportunities in high school. And psychology sounded interesting, and I'd never heard of it and never learned anything about it. And in my Psych 101 Introduction to Psychology course, we learned about behavior analysis in one of the first weeks. And we talked about how it's a data-driven science and how we use observation to sort of synthesize everyday behaviors into data points on a graph. And that just immediately set off sparks for me because it was marrying things that I was passionate about, right? So data analysis, using quantitative methods to evaluate change, and it just seemed super appealing. So I was fortunate enough to get involved in some research labs at my undergraduate institution that set me up to then pursue my PhD, all focusing on basic laboratory sciences. So I was working with pigeons and rats, and now I'm doing some work with mice as well. And all through my master's degree, all through my PhD, I was in a laboratory in a basement of a laboratory animal research center, really enjoying the work that I was doing, really passionate about finding out the whys and the hows of behavior. But I also became really interested in where the rubber hit the road, so to speak. So again, I was learning a lot about basic behavior process, but I was also starting to ask questions about persistence and relapse, things that have great translational utility. So my advisor, Tim Shahan, suggested that I maybe branch out a little bit in my postdoctoral experiences, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work with Wayne Fisher and Brian Greer and Amanda Zangrillo at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, where I learned more about providing services to children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the moment that I started working with kids, I never looked back because it was such a rewarding experience where I had the opportunity not only to learn more about behavior and to explore the boundaries of our science, but also to do that while directly helping people. So now I'm a faculty member at SUNY Upstate Medical University, where I don't know what I did to be as lucky as I am to have a foot in the basic research lab, a foot in the clinic, directing educational programs, and helping to mentor the next generation of behavior analysts.
Thank you, Andrew. Much of your research has focused on understanding why behavior persists and why previously reduced behavior sometimes come back. Why do you think these questions are so important for both researchers and clinicians?
Another fantastic question. I think that these areas of research, much like many other areas of research within behavior analysis, are important for both our understanding of basic behavior process and for application of those behavior principles to affect socially significant behavior change. So focusing on the behavior process part first, this is the portion of the science that really got me interested in behavior analysis to begin with. Persistence and relapse indicate that whenever we change behavior, right, it's not like behavior immediately adheres to whatever contingencies we put in place. There's something about a behavior history that pushes behavior forward, despite the fact that we are trying to modify it. That might look like facilitating acquisition, or introducing a behavior reduction strategy, behavior change is not instantaneous, right? We have to work with that behavior history to produce that behavior change. And then relapse gets even more complicated, right? Because we might reduce a behavior to very, very, very low levels, or even completely eliminate a behavior. But what I've come to understand is that when we say behavior elimination, that's kind of a misnomer, because what we're doing isn't like other fields of medicine, right? Where we have some treatment that is a cure for whatever behavior we're trying to either acquire or reduce. We are simply arranging effective educational opportunities, effective learning situations for whatever the individual is that we're working with. That might be a non-human animal, it might be a human participant, or client in a behavior center like the one that I work in. So even though we might eliminate that behavior, if there are a host of different environmental manipulations or circumstances that occur, that behavior might come back, right? So we're not clipping out components of an individual's repertoire that we might not want to see anymore. We're, again, just arranging the environment in such a way that we are favoring more adaptive behavior repertoires and reducing or minimizing reinforcement for behaviors that we don't want to see anymore. So it's this idea that Mark Boughton has been very passionate about in his writing, that extinction isn't erasure of previous learning. We're not getting rid of that learning. It's still there. And under certain circumstances, it can come back. Sometimes that's adaptive, sometimes that's maladaptive. And learning more about the hows and whys of that behavior change, I think, is critical for us not only to understand how that behavior history has continued effects on behavior, even though that history might not be enforced right now, but it also then clearly has implications for our clinical practice. Everything that we do in applied behavior analysis, no matter what context you are working in, is focused on either helping individuals acquire behaviors that are adaptive, or helping individuals overcome challenges that pose barriers to them from a behavioral perspective. And whenever you have either of those goals in mind, you're fighting against resistance to change. So a basic learning history is going to determine whether or not behavior changes immediately whenever you implement new contingencies. Knowing something about the variables that impact persistence is going to help us make those initial treatment decisions. Maybe I need to, if I know that a behavior is coming from a situation under which it's promoting a lot of persistence, maybe I need to do a little bit more work as a clinician to ensure that my treatment is immediately effective. Or, when we talk about maintenance and generalization of behavior change, after I've affected that really potent behavior change and I've accomplished all of my clinical goals, I need to keep in mind that there are these host of environmental circumstances under which behavior might come back. And there are things that I can do that Stokes and Baer told us about way back in the day to encourage behavioral treatment generalization and treatment maintenance as an interventionist, right? So I can potentially incorporate new treatment elements, train loosely, train multiple exemplars to help ensure that whenever my client encounters those sorts of issues out in the natural environment, their behavior change maintains in the long term. So I think this area of research is super helpful, not only because it's providing that window into how behavior history continues to impact behavior contemporaneously, or contemporarily, but also how we can effectively use what we learn about why behavior does what it does to ensure that we're doing the best that we can to produce treatments that have effects that maintain and generalize.
Amazing. Thank you, Andrew. And one of the concepts that appears frequently in your work is behavioral momentum. For people who may not be familiar with it, how would you explain that it is and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to start, behavioral momentum is this idea that whenever you deliver consequences in the presence of a discriminative stimulus, as we always are, right? Consequences are always delivered in the presence of some contextual arrangement. And I don't think that this is a controversial argument. Organisms build associations between those stimuli that are present in their environment and the reinforcers that are delivered in the presence of those stimuli. Think about a child in a classroom, for example. And I'm sure that you and anyone else who is listening can relate to this. Some classrooms, some instructors load behavior down with reinforcers, and those students build those associations between being in that specific classroom and receiving a lot of diverse sources of reinforcement. Some classrooms are less dense sources of reinforcement, where there might be an association still between some social reinforcers, but they happen less frequently. So we're building these stimulus-stimulus associations, and those stimulus-stimulus associations drive persistence in behavior, with the idea that, and this is empirically supported, environments that are associated with more reinforcement are the same environments that are going to engender more persistent responding. So Tony Nevin and his colleagues were doing some really influential work in this area, using multiple schedules and pigeon subjects. I'm thinking of a paper that was published back in 1974 that had 5 different experiments in it, where they evaluated, this was a single author paper by Tony Nevin. He evaluated the effects of reinforcer rates, reinforcer magnitudes, reinforcer immediacies in different components of a multiple schedule. And then he tried to disrupt behavior in a couple of different ways, right? So he either, these were pigeons that were responding on keys for food reinforcement. He either placed behavior on extinction, or he presented some portion of the pigeon's daily allotment of food response independently. To partially satiate them on those reinforcers. And he showed that the more he tried to slow behavior down, the more it slowed down, which makes sense, right? So if you give a pigeon more food, they're going to be less motivated to peck a key to gain access to still further food. But here is the really critical piece that I think started the snowball rolling down the hill with behavioral momentum theory, and that is that the multiple schedule component that was associated with a subjectively better condition of reinforcement, whether that be a higher rate of reinforcement, a more immediate reinforcer, a larger magnitude reinforcer, was also the component that was associated with more persistent behavior. And he and his colleagues and other researchers demonstrated this finding over and over and over and over again. It's a very highly replicated outcome in the experimental analysis of behavior. And when you start to see that consistency in a functional relation, the next question that we should ask as scientists is why, right? And in 1983, he and Mendel and Atak developed behavioral momentum theory as a way of making sense of this very robust functional relation that they were seeing again and again and again in their experimental analyses. And momentum theory is all built on this analogy between operant behavior and the way that objects move in the physical world, right? So if I were to, talking about snowballs on the top of a hill, if I were to start rolling a snowball down a hill, right? If it was a really teeny tiny snowball and it was encountering some friction on the ground, that friction is a force that is opposing the rolling motion of the snowball, and it's eventually going to stop rolling, right? Now, if I took a big giant snowball and I tried to roll that down the hill, it's going to go farther, despite the fact that the same friction is operating on that snowball. So that is a demonstration of Newton's second law of motion, that objects that have more mass, when they're acted on by the same outside force, are going to be harder to slow down than objects that have smaller mass. And Tony Nevin was thinking, you know, I see this parallel here, right? The more reinforcers that I deliver, it's harder to slow behavior down, kind of like physical objects whenever they're being acted on by some force that opposes motion. So maybe the stimulus reinforcer relation that we're building produces some mass-like quality of behavior, which is a hypothetical construct, but this behavioral mass might make behavior more or less likely to slow down whenever we introduce disruptive operations. So he built that sort of analogy between Newton's second law of motion and the way that behavior operates in these complex conditioning situations, and he didn't stop there, right? So he told the story, and then he started to build quantitative models that provided a structure around which we could wrap that story. And the quantitative analysis of behavior, I think, is particularly appealing not only to basic laboratory scientists, because it gives them predictions that they can go test in their laboratory settings, but also this is one of the reasons that I think this area of research has been so helpful in terms of its translational utility. It gives us as clinicians things that we can look at about the clinical situations that we're arranging, and make predictions about, ooh, is behavior going to persist if I try to slow it down after this type of a conditioning arrangement or this type of a conditioning arrangement. And behavioral momentum theory since has been extended to better understand more complex behavioral outcomes like relapse. So there are different models to describe outcomes like resurgence, renewal, reinstatement, spontaneous recovery, disinhibition, that they're slightly different, but the core argument is still there, that this mask-like quality of behavior is related to these stimulus-stimulus relations in the environment, and they prop behavior up whenever you're otherwise trying to slow it down. So behavioral momentum theory is this analogy between physics and behavioral psychology, which is kind of cool, but it also provides this really robust quantitative framework that we can use to make predictions about behavior. Now, I just want to note that there have been a lot of challenging data sets that have been generated that suggest that behavioral momentum theory might have some holes in it that prevent it from being a really robust general theory of persistence. And I would certainly be happy to connect with any interested audience members about what those holes look like. But I bring that up not to suggest that we shouldn't use momentum theory to guide the way that we think about persistence, but instead to highlight that there is a whole broad avenue for continued theoretical development in this area. So if anyone is interested in persistence and relapse, I would love to talk to you about the sort of the wild, wild west of theory development in this area.
Love that. Thank you, Andrew. Another major area of your research is resurgency. Okay. What have we learned about relapse from studying resurgency, and how can that knowledge improve behavioral interventions?
Oh my gosh. So resurgence, big broad question. Resurgence is a very specific kind of relapse, right? So I just mentioned that there are a lot of different environmental manipulations that we know make behavior change fragile. For example, with renewal, if I change the context in which treatment took place, behavior might come back. So think about someone who seeks treatment for substance use disorders. They go into an inpatient setting. They do really, really well in that setting. They're able to get clean. They then move back into their natural environment, and drug taking cravings might come right back because of that change in context. Reinstatement is relapse that is occasioned by representing lost reinforcers. So again, in the context of substance use treatment, I'm an ex-smoker, and if I'm walking down the street and I smell cigarette smoke, right, that stimulus, which is paired with the primary reinforcing effects of nicotine, induces craving, which might produce relapse, which is, in that case, reinstatement. Resurgence is an interesting and slightly more complicated form of relapse that is occasioned by loss of or a reduction in the quality of an alternative source of reinforcement that was made available during response elimination. So here, think about the way that we go about treatment for complex behaviors in children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We first ask why through assessment those behaviors happen. And we often find that those behaviors happen because they help the individual gain access to reinforcers like adult attention, access to tangible items or preferred activities, or escape from aversive situations. We then move into a differential reinforcement-based treatment where we minimize access to reinforcement for those unsafe or complex behaviors that we don't want to see anymore, that are causing barriers for those clients. And instead, we teach those individuals to engage in a safer pro-social form of communication to gain access to those same reinforcers. So let's say that I'm a child, I gain access to my caregiver's attention by engaging in aggressive behavior. I could instead use a card exchange response or a card touch response or vocal verbal behavior and ask for my caregiver to play, right? Now, that's all well and good, and that's a specific treatment called functional communication training. It's very, very effective at reducing behavior and, importantly, equipping those learners with an alternative response that helps them navigate their environments in a safer manner. But now let's think about what happens in the natural environment. If a child asks for attention and the caregiver's on the phone, or they're busy attending to another sibling, or the caregiver is simply unavailable for whatever reason, that request might go unhonored. And in the case that that behavior is placed on extinction, we might see that initial behavior, the complex behavior, resurge or come back. So resurgence is, I think, highly relevant for clinical practice. All of these relapse phenomena are very important for our understanding of how behavior history affects behavior, right? We started the conversation talking about behavior history, and they all demonstrate that extinction is not erasure of previous learning. We can learn multiple different things about the way that our behavior affects the environment. But these relapse-inducing events allow behavior history, even though it might be days, weeks, months ago, to again affect current responding. But this form of relapse, resurgence, is so highly related to behavior reduction strategies that we use in clinical practice that I think that's where a lot of applied researchers really started to gain traction on basic research on persistence and relapse, because they saw, oh my gosh, this is directly relevant to the way that I go about my interventions, whether that be in the context of assessment and treatment of complex behaviors like those that we just talked about, using functional communication training or other differential reinforcement-based strategies, or another area of research that I am super passionate about is addiction treatment. And we do kind of the same thing in that context, right? We use contingency management, for example, where individuals provide proof that they were abstinent from drug taking, and then we give them non-drug incentives contingently on that more socially appropriate adaptive behavioral repertoire. The problem with contingency management-based interventions is that they often are, they're money intensive, and money dries up, treatment ends, and what happens whenever you remove that source of alternative reinforcement? Well, the literature tells us that contingency management is super effective while it's in place, but when you remove it, even though it's one of the most effective intervention strategies that we have for substance use disorders, more often than not, we see behavior come back. We see individuals engage in drug taking again, which can pose substantial barriers to the long-term maintenance of those outcomes. So resurgence is not unique in that, I think all these relapse outcomes are still telling us something very important about behavior history and sort of pointing us in the same directions. But I think resurgence in particular has gotten a lot of attention recently because of those very clear connections to the way that we as clinicians go about modifying behavior.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. And what do you think about why it is so important to bridge the gap between laboratory research and clinical practice?
Because that's how we go farther faster, right? Clinical researchers are developing cutting-edge technologies to produce just fabulous treatment outcomes with the various clinical populations that they work with. Basic laboratory scientists are learning more about the effects of those sorts of variables within behavioral histories and how they can potentially impact responding down the line. And learning more from one another, I think, puts us all in a position where we have not only more research questions to ask, but also we are perhaps better equipped to develop treatments that help us overcome barriers to treatment generalization and maintenance, like resurgence, renewal, reinstatement, etc. So what I've tried to do with my program of research, and I think that I've been so successful in this area only because I've been able to identify just phenomenal applied and translational collaborators who are able to speak really directly to the barriers that they experience in their treatment lives. What I've tried to do with my area of research is to directly bridge that gap, so that I can learn things in my basic research settings that I can then generalize into human populations using human laboratory analyses of behavior. And then once I have that initial demonstration in human populations, move them into in the direction of clinical practice. But it also works in the opposite direction, right? Where I can work with my collaborators here at SUNY Upstate Medical University and elsewhere throughout the world, who are identifying those barriers to their treatments, who are the individuals who are delivering those high quality treatments to the folks who need them. And we can synthesize those barriers, bring them down into the laboratory setting, learn more about why they exist and what we can do about them, and then move those suggested treatment strategies back into application to directly overcome those barriers. And that's not to say that you can't conduct that research on overcoming barriers to treatment in applied settings. And that's not to say that you need a foot in the basic laboratory to better understand basic behavior process. Often, I think that this, it's just my opinion that this whole applied basic duality, it's a false dichotomy, right? We're all learning stuff about basic process, and all the stuff that we're learning in the laboratory has direct translational utility, whether or not researchers are identifying what that utility looks like. But nevertheless, there are benefits to these different research areas, right? So, for example, I work in an outpatient clinic where my clients come for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, and then they leave the clinic. And I have absolutely no idea what their environment looks like when they leave the clinic. And one of the stories that I like to tell is, we work with kids who have pediatric feeding disorders, and everything might be going perfectly well during the course of treatment. And then all of a sudden on a Thursday, a client comes in, they're not motivated, they're not engaging with staff, they're not taking the bites of food that we're trying to deliver. And I scratch my head and I go to the caregivers and I say, has anything changed that might cause this issue with treatment today? And, I've heard multiple times, nothing has changed in my kid's home. Nothing has changed in the school. We stopped at McDonald's on the way over and he had an appetite then. Well, okay, that's probably it, right? These uncontrolled variables in the natural environment could impact my data in a way that makes it complicated for me to make assessments about functional relations. Whereas with my rats, I know where they live outside of their daily sessions. I know what their extra experimental experiences look like. I know what chow they get. I know how much chow they get. All of those variables are under tight control so that I'm able to more directly investigate questions about functional relations between independent and dependent variables. So the basic laboratory, I think, provides an invaluable tool for behavior analysts to start to drill down in a more direct manner on those basic functional relations that we can then move into applied settings. And similarly, applied settings provide incredibly important research areas or research approaches for us to better understand whether or not what we're doing matters, whether or not the functional relations that we're identifying in the laboratory are going to have any impact on clinical practice. Because as a translational researcher, if I can't say that with confidence, that's a problem. And also clinical practice is where we learn more about those barriers to treatment that we need to overcome. So building those bridges, I think, help us move as a field farther, faster, and provide the highest quality, most effective, most efficient services to the individuals who need them.
Absolutely. And looking ahead, what do you think are the biggest challenges or perhaps the most exciting opportunities for behavior analysis over the next 10 years, for example?
I love the way that you phrased that, right? So you started by saying challenges. Oh, wait, they're opportunities. That's always the case, right? We're empiricists. Whenever we encounter a challenge, that's an opportunity for us to learn more about behavior process that can help us overcome those challenging situations. There are heaps and heaps and heaps of directions in behavior analysis that I'm really, really excited about. But speaking more directly to my area of research, one of the very cool sort of branches of the study of persistence and relapse has been on what folks are calling behavioral inoculation. So what are those things that we can do as scientists or as scientist practitioners to, during the course of treatment, ensure that once behavior generalizes into the natural environment, that behavior change is going to maintain over time. And we are, as a field, starting to learn an awful lot about strategies that we can use to effectively encourage treatment maintenance and treatment generalization in a systematic manner, right? So Stokes and Baer suggested that we work on these problems decades ago. And there has been some dedicated, coordinated research in those decades to better figure out the efficiency of these different strategies for programming for generalization and maintenance. But one of the really cool areas of growth in the study of relapse is that it's getting people very excited about learning more about strategies for programming for maintenance and generalization. So these have been long-standing problems in the applied analysis and experimental analysis of behavior that we are, again, as a field, starting to get some traction on and make some motion on. So I hope over the course of the next 10 years, the individuals who are out there doing the good work in these areas, including some of my collaborators here at SUNY Upstate, are able to answer these questions. Now, that isn't to say that there will ever be a situation under which, there won't be continued room for improvement. One of the cool things about behavior analysis is that we are an approach to treatment. We're a science and an approach to treatment that is highly individualized. We focus on the behavior of individuals. Individuals have idiosyncratic behavioral histories that interact with these different strategies that we can use in sometimes unexpected ways that are cause for us to roll up our sleeves and engage in some problem solving. So there will always be opportunities to learn more about those idiosyncratic factors. But I really anticipate motion in the area of behavioral inoculation over the next decade. And just one other area of research that I want to highlight that comes to mind specifically because of Doctors Emily Ferris and Courtney Mosey, who are some of my close collaborators here at Upstate, is this idea of integrating technology into not only our laboratory analyses of behavior, but also our assessment and treatment procedures for the populations that we serve. So for example, Dr. Emily Ferris is doing some really groundbreaking research using virtual reality training to help children with intellectual and developmental disabilities more successfully navigate training situations that would be extremely difficult to arrange in everyday settings. So for example, her dissertation with Dr. Nicole Rodriguez at the University of Nebraska Medical Center focused on pedestrian safety with children. So that's the idea of teaching children to safely cross the street, teaching children to maintain safety in public areas where there may be motor vehicles. And as you can imagine, that would be very, very dangerous and very hard to do if we just took kids down to a busy thoroughfare and gave them the opportunity to learn through trials, right? But using virtual reality, she completely rebuilt neighborhoods within Omaha and had her clients wearing a virtual reality helmet and moving on sort of a two-dimensional treadmill so that they could walk in any direction. She had them practicing these really important skills in a safe environment where they couldn't get hurt, and then showed that they can generalize those skills into real world settings. Right now, she's working on taking some of that technology and expanding access to care in behavior analysis to communities that don't have clinical providers locally. Just to talk a bit about sort of our situation here in central New York. If this is New York State, I love that most of the states that I live in, you can show on your hand, right? So that's Pennsylvania, that's Utah. So that's kind of New York State. We're about here, right in the center of the state in central New York, as the name implies. On either side of the state, we have Buffalo or Albany, lots of clinical providers in those three hubs. But in all of the surrounding areas, it's kind of a treatment desert. We do have traveling ABA agencies that can send individuals into the home setting to help produce socially significant behavior change. But for the highly specialized treatments that we deliver, like assessment and treatment of complex behavior or pediatric feeding disorders, we have clients who are driving 2+ hours a day, 5 days a week, both ways to access services from us. And imagine how innovative and sort of life-changing it could be if we could deliver some of these services through virtual reality. So she's trying to figure out how to deliver pediatric feeding services or to increase the efficiency of pediatric feeding services using virtual reality platforms. And then Dr. Mosey is working on innovative gamified ways to study persistence and relapse. Lots of the same kinds of questions that I ask in my own personal research. And I think we have a study that's coming out in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, shameless self-promotion, right? Where we are showing that you can really effectively use this sort of gamified environment to produce behavioral outcomes that are highly similar to the behavioral outcomes that we produce in basic laboratory settings, which has been a giant headache for the field. And we've known about this for decades, right? So human laboratory research sometimes fails to replicate the kinds of behavioral patterns that we see in clinical or basic laboratory settings. And he is taking the tack of gamifying or making these more engaging activities to get students involved, get participants involved. And they're producing pretty cool outcomes. So I'm really excited for his work to get out there and to see where his approach to studying human behavior can take us as a field.
Mm-hmm. Finally, you're going to be one of the speakers at the upcoming 14th SABEC Congress. Could you tell us a little about your presentation and what attendees can expect to learn from your talk?
Yeah, absolutely. So fortunately, I just talked about some of Dr. Courtney Mosey's really innovative recent research that will be featured as a component of the talk. But the talk itself will focus on a technology that is on the cutting edge of treatment for complex behaviors of concern in children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, I talked about functional communication training and functional analysis a little bit earlier. One of the strategies that has been used recently is what is referred to as synthesized contingencies, where instead of asking, is there an isolated reinforcer that maintains behavior, like adult attention, access to preferred items or activities, escape from aversive situations, individuals might deliver multiple different reinforcers that are informed by interviews that they have with caregivers and other stakeholders in the care of those individuals, all at the same time to modify behavior. And there are really, really good reasons to do that. The first of which is that with analog functional analysis, where we're probing out these individual reinforcers that might maintain behavior, sometimes that can happen very quickly. We might be able to have a client come to our clinic for 1 hour a day and get through a functional analysis in 2 or 3 days, right? Sometimes it takes a really, really long time to get from the beginning of assessment to effective treatment. So there's that delay in treatment provision that is, under some circumstances, just untenable, right? So I've worked with children who have engaged in behaviors that were so dangerous that they might pose an immediate risk of harm, like very, very severe harm to self or others. Under those situations, I can't wait a week. I can't wait a week and a half to get from the beginning of assessment to treatment. So under those circumstances, I might deliver a synthesized reinforcer that is based on information that I've collected from other care providers. Now, here's the rub, right? We've talked about how variables in an individual's learning history impact persistence and relapse. And sometimes, if you're just looking at the behavior reduction data, you might not see that there are effects of those variables in the history on what's going to happen next for behavior. We know, for example, that higher rates of reinforcement, larger magnitudes of reinforcement, more immediate reinforcers, not only promote persistence, but they also are associated with more relapse. So if I increase the rate or magnitude or immediacy of a reinforcer, I'm probably going to see more relapse of that behavior once it encounters situations that cause reinstatement, renewal, resurgence. So Dr. Sean Smith, who is another collaborator of mine here at SUNY Upstate Medical University, Dr. Courtney Mosey and I developed this collaborative area of research where we are using all of the bright, beautiful, shiny things that we have down in the basic laboratory to learn more about the effects of those sorts of variables in an individual's learning history on relapse. By conducting manipulations like comparing synthesized reinforcers to isolated reinforcers in terms not only of how much response persistence they engender, but also how much relapse they engender. And then looking at situations where we are reducing the quality of an alternative source of reinforcement that was made available during response elimination, either by completely suspending reinforcement, suspending one of those synthesized reinforcers, the other of those synthesized reinforcers. So we're starting to use basic laboratory sciences to directly inform what's on the cutting edge of assessment and treatment strategies for complex behavior. And I'm really excited to talk to the audience about this area of research.
Thank you very much for your time, Andrew. It has been a real pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to seeing you soon at the 14th SABEC Congress. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Absolutely. I look forward to seeing all of you as well.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Of course.